The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We thought it might be coming, and here it is. A group of Republicans have started impeachment proceedings against Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. And this is how it begins. It's just some Republicans that are starting the escalation, including Republican Mark Meadows and Republican Jim Jordan, who are sort of spearheading this effort. What they didn't do yet was force a vote on the issue. And this gives a sort of temporary break to the Republicans in the House that are against this measure, because there are Republicans in the House who say, this is not a good idea. This is not what we should be doing. And the explanation for why they're doing this from Jordan and Meadows is that they're tired of the Justice Department not giving them information they believe they're entitled to, and the American people are sick of it. And all 11 representatives who filed the resolution are members of the House Freedom Caucus, sort of a very wacky right-wing group of Congress people. And first of all, when I read the list of who's doing this, my immediate thought was Jim Jordan shouldn't be doing anything until we figure out what his role was in the cover-up of sexual assault when he was a wrestling coach. Full stop. And he's clearly eager for any opportunity to distract from that. And, you know, what can I sign on to? Impeach Rosenstein? Sure, put my name on it. But the bigger picture is that this is part of a growing effort to attack Rod Rosenstein, obviously with the goal of interfering in the Trump-Russia investigation. And the Justice Department denies the allegations that they aren't providing information. They say they provided everything that was subpoenaed unless there was a specific reason to withhold a particular document, period. But this doesn't stop some Republicans like Matt Gaetz from saying things like, there's a mountain of evidence against Rod Rosenstein, and it is actually more likely, I believe, that Trump will use the impeachment articles as a pretext to fire Rosenstein, rather than that the White House, that the full House of Representatives, rather, will actually vote to do it. And even if the House voted to do it, it's still not likely that the Senate would actually move to remove Rosenstein. And of course, that's the way it has to work. The House would vote on it. The Senate would actually do it. Senators, I think, would realize that moving to remove Rosenstein would not be good for many of their reelection campaigns in parts of the country. In some places, it would be absolutely fine. There are some senators who would suffer if they actually moved to remove Rosenstein. It's difficult to say, if, of course, the House actually voted that way.
Well, especially because impeachments of federal officials are so rare, right?
Yes.
It maybe happens once every 10 years. So if you're going to make that case, you really got to bring it, and they don't have that supporting evidence.
And you have to be sure, I hate that term, this is the hill you want to die on. But you've got to be sure that this is how you want to expend some political capital, right? And fundamentally, this is a misuse of power, or it would be if it were carried forward. It's also just the wrong reaction if you're not getting the documents you want. If you're not getting the documents you want from the Justice Department, they're not giving them to you as you claim. Impeachment is a punishment, but if what you actually want is the documents, there are other ways to ensure that you get the documents. And that's why this seems like a panicked reaction, maybe to the Michael Cohen tapes leaking, maybe to something else, and not actually a means through which you would get the documents you want, because impeachment is a punishment.
So what's the end game here? That Republicans either force Rosenstein out or Trump fires Rosenstein and then replace him with a new Deputy Attorney General who will fire Robert Mueller and end the Trump-Russia investigation?
The most important part of this is that it relates to Trump-Russia, right? That's what this is all connected to. And you proposed a couple of different paths that it could go. Maybe there are others. And at its core, the most important part of this farce is that the articles of impeachment cite things related to Carter Page's FISA warrants from 2016. Rosenstein didn't become Deputy Attorney General till April of 2017. So how can you be citing things that happened before the guy was in the role as part of the reason why he needs to go? And maybe he's a time traveler, but short of being a time traveler, this isn't even remotely reasonable. And I'm seeing two major reactions to this, or sort of like major themes. One reaction is, this is it. Republicans are killing the Trump-Russia probe now. It's going to be over within a month. The other reaction is, oh no, this is about to escalate to such a degree that these are the clear last gasps of a dying presidency, and this is the panic that is setting in. I actually don't know that it's either. I think it could go on like this for a long time, a little bit of a push one way, a push in the other direction, with individual Republicans trying to either make a name for themselves or in other ways get attention or maybe get on Trump's radar as some kind of hero who's coming to his defense. But if you look at internet articles about this impeachment resolution, you will see the comments littered with obvious Russian troll bot posts. And that's one way of knowing that this is kind of a big deal when it comes to the broader investigation. We'll follow it and see what ultimately happens. I told you earlier this week about the growing war on the media that Donald Trump is waging, and it's getting worse. And sadly, I don't know if the press corps is totally ready to fight against it. They're speaking up, but what will they actually do? Here's what happened. The White House banned CNN journalist Kaitlan Collins from attending a Rose Garden event yesterday at the White House. She was called into the White House and badgered and scolded for so-called inappropriate questions that she asked Trump during an Oval Office event earlier yesterday. Who was one of the officials who read Kaitlan Collins the riot act? It was Bill Shine, formerly of Fox News, now of the White House, as well as Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Well, these must have been wildly inappropriate questions, right? Not really. One of them was, did Michael Cohen betray you? Something Kaitlan Collins asked President Trump yesterday. Really inappropriate, right? Mr. President, are you worried about what Michael Cohen will say to prosecutors? Whoa, we got to get her out right away. We have the video. These are Kaitlan Collins's inappropriate questions and her supposedly inappropriate behavior at the White House yesterday.
Michael Cohen betray you, Mr. President?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Mr. President, did Michael Cohen betray you?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Mr. President, are you worried about what Michael Cohen is going to say to prosecutors?
Thank you, Caleb. Let's keep going.
Are you worried about what is on the other tapes, Mr. President?
Thank you all. Let's keep going. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody.
Why has Vladimir Putin not accepted your invitation?
Keep going. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Let's go. Come on, guys. Thank you very much.
We're done. We're done. Let's go. Why has Vladimir Putin not accepted your invitation, Mr. President?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This really is not a big deal. I mean, there's a lot of screaming and pushing and whatever. It always goes this way. And the idea that this was just so offensive and inappropriate that Kaitlan Collins deserved to be banned is crazy. So we've got good news and bad news. The good news here is that most media outlets, even Fox News, are defending Kaitlan Collins. And Fox News put out a statement saying, quote, "We stand in strong solidarity with CNN for the right to full access for our journalists as part of a free and unfettered press." The White House Correspondents Association also put out a statement saying that this was wholly inappropriate, not Kaitlan Collins' behavior, but kicking her out of a subsequent event because she asked these questions. The White House Correspondents Association said it was wholly inappropriate, wrong-headed, and weak. This is the creeping authoritarianism that I've been warning about for a year and a half now. And Trump recently said at a rally, what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening, basically saying you cannot believe even the most basic facts being reported by the media. Authoritarian dictatorships and fascist regimes tell the citizenry literally, do not believe what you see in the news. They ban media they don't like from covering them. And these aren't tactics that start to shade in the direction of authoritarianism. They're straight out of that playbook, period. And there's another fact that makes this even worse, which is that Kaitlan Collins wasn't in the Oval Office merely as a CNN reporter in the video I played for you. She was there as a reporter representing the press pool, which sometimes happens. One reporter is designated as representing the press pool at a particular event. So without Kaitlan's questions, there were no questions, period, which is exactly what the White House wants. The narrative can't be questioned, and that's what the Trump administration wants. And if your view is, David, listen, CNN has been unfair to Trump, and they sort of deserve this. CNN was the only press representation at that Oval Office event because Kaitlan Collins was the press pool reporter. So when CNN was singled out as being inappropriate, they were representing the press at large during that event. And it's sort of like kicking out the media, period. Now, legally, there are questions. This was a credentialed White House reporter. If you ban a credentialed reporter from an open press event, the later event at the Rose Garden, because you didn't like her questions, she didn't commit a crime, she didn't leak classified information, she didn't do anything, she didn't break into the Oval Office, you just didn't like the questions, that might be a violation of the First Amendment. And as usual, there will never be repercussions for it, and it will be a statement that some ethics lawyer tells us in a week, and then, of course, it'll be forgotten because there will be 10 more scandals by then. But there is that legal question. And when you look at Fox News saying the White House crossed the line with CNN, you know how backward things have gotten. And this is because, and we're very critical of Fox News on the opinion side all the time, Pat. It's completely whacked out in the tank for Trump on the opinion side. There are actually proper, standard, traditional journalists that work for Fox News who recognize the danger of this. Usually their views are overridden by the opinion side of Fox News. I'm not defending Fox News as an entity, but there are just normal journalists at Fox News who see this for what it is.
Yeah, we talk about like Shep Smith and Brett Baer, but there are also those journalists who you never really hear about. And,
exactly.
You know, we see an instance of integrity here from Fox News, and that's pretty rare.
It's horrible that the opinion and bias permeates the news side at Fox News, but the actual reporters, and I'm actually in touch with a couple of them. There's a couple of Fox News just baseline reporters, regular field reporters who pay attention to the David Pakman Show. It might be shocking to some of you. They do put their personal politics aside. They just understand the basics of journalistic integrity, which have been violated here. And it often doesn't come through on the Fox News channel, but real journalists recognize how this is extraordinarily dangerous. And this is a danger that we all need to be fighting against. It's creeping. We know Trump wants it. He's talked about journalism licenses. He's talked about trying to pull certain publications out of print or off air. It's really scary stuff, and we're seeing a little bit of the press corps banding together. So Fox News put out a statement. We saw a couple of examples of when Sarah Huckabee Sanders didn't answer a question from one reporter. The next reporter called on, said, can you ask the same question, or said, can you answer that question? So we're seeing a little bit of it, but the degree to which this anti-media crusade is building should freak everybody out. Whether you're a progressive leftist or a constitutional rightist or whatever, this is a red alert.
And we also have to be worried about self-censorship too, because if you know that if you ask a tough question, they'll cut your access. Turns out in the next press conference, you may ask something that's not so pressing.
Yes, there's no question about it. And that is, it's sort of like on YouTube where, listen, you can put up any video you want, but depending on what you put up, it might not have ads run and therefore you won't make any money. Strictly speaking, you're not banned from putting up whatever video you want, but you may start to self-censor in order to have your videos monetized. Similar sort of dynamic. Send me your thoughts, and specifically my question for you is, if you believe I am overblowing this press war against the press, write in and tell me why. I'm on Twitter at dpakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day, Trudy Smith. Trudy, thank you. We are mostly supported by members like Trudy and also longtime members like Terry Eddings, who has been with us since January of 2013. Very, very close to 6 years, 5.5 years of membership for Terry. Trudy, Terry, thank you. Sign up at www.joinpakman.com. Save 40% using the coupon code VOTESOON18. Okay, we do have a David Pakman Show discussion forum. It's not on our website. It is a subreddit, and you can find it by going to davidpakman.com/Reddit, which will redirect you to the David Pakman Show subreddit on Reddit. Lots of great discussions happening there, including a story I haven't had time to get to this week about Julian Assange of WikiLeaks fame. It has been widely reported that it is expected that Ecuador will withdraw asylum for Julian Assange. Julian Assange of WikiLeaks fame has been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for how many years at this point? I don't even know.
Quite a few, right?
Several years. And there is every expectation, according to a number of reports, that Ecuador will withdraw that asylum and Julian Assange may soon be arrested. I don't know ultimately what will happen, but it is clear that the status quo cannot persist indefinitely. And we've known that at some point something was going to have to change. We did learn, by the way, during the time that Julian Assange has been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy, that there were numerous connections to Russian meddling in 2016 Hannity, Donald Trump Jr., and all sorts of other stuff. And quite frankly, I want to know the full story when it comes to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
I don't know if Ecuador withdrawing its asylum will expedite us finding out the full and true story, but it is a story I really want to know more about.
And of course, Donald Trump loves WikiLeaks, so maybe he can work his magic, talk
Yeah.
with Theresa May, talk with Queen Elizabeth II,
Yes.
and make sure that Assange gets a great deal.
Now Trump likes Assange, right? But at some point, he was really bad, I think.
I think it depends on the day of the week.
Yeah, I think that's basically what it is. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, one of our viewers, J473, says unequivocally, Donald Trump will not be reelected. Just thought I would call it here first. And of course, I am not confident about that. I think that actually there is a very good chance Trump is reelected. I believe it is abundantly clear that because of low voter turnout in the United States, because of the continued 38-ish% approval rating of Donald Trump, you could see Donald Trump reelected with only something like 22% of the adult population in the United States voting for him. And I think that it is no foregone conclusion that Trump doesn't get a second term.
Donald Trump will never run for president. Donald Trump will never win a debate. Donald Trump will never be the Republican nominee.
Well, he
Donald
never won
Trump
the debates.
will never be president. Are you noticing a pattern here?
There is a pattern, other than he didn't win any of those debates.
That first one,
You think he did?
I think he did.
One out of, was that when there were 17 other people on the stage with him?
Yeah.
Okay, join the discussion at davidpakman.com/reddit. Yesterday, I told you about one of the most beta moments, and by beta, I mean beta as opposed to alpha moments of the Trump presidency, which was that after Donald Trump invited Vladimir Putin to the White House after the Helsinki summit, Putin turned it down. And it's truly the opposite of a power move from Trump. It's yet another humiliation, as I told you yesterday. This wasn't some maybe someday type of invitation. Trump even tweeted about it last week. It was very clear plans were being made. Trump saying the summit with Russia was a great success, except with the real enemy of the people, the fake news media. I look forward to our second meeting so that we can start implementing some of the many things discussed, including stopping terrorism, security for Israel, nuclear proliferation, cyber attacks, trade, Ukraine, Middle East peace, North Korea, and more. There are many answers, some easy and some hard, to these problems, but they can all be solved. Totally played by Putin. Putin says, I'm not going to do it. Putin looks like the powerful one. He simply can't be bothered to come to Washington, D.C. And now, what does the Trump White House do? They retract the invitation. But wait a second. Putin already said he wasn't coming. Why is the invitation being retracted? Great question. I have no idea. Could the White House possibly look weaker than it looks right now? NSA, National Security Advisor John Bolton said in a statement yesterday that this Trump-Putin meeting, quote, should take place after the Russia witch hunt is over. So we've agreed that it will be after the first of the year. But Putin already said he's not coming. Do you want to come to my birthday party? No, I don't. Well, I'm retracting your invitation anyway, so you can't come to it. This was called. We knew this would happen, and it happened.
I also didn't know that the Russia investigation was going to be over with by the end of the year.
Yeah, it was going to be over with by the end of last year. And now it's going to be over with by the end of this year. It's the George Costanza presidency, or the Larry David presidency. I don't know which is a better term for it. This is the same thing Trump did with some sports teams. I don't remember now if it was like the Philadelphia Eagles, the Golden State Warriors. Maybe it was both. Yep. When the players started saying, we're not going to go to the White House for this meet and greet, Trump canceled the invitation or the event altogether and instead had like a flag rally or something like that. If there's any way to sum up in total the presidency of Trump in terms of its style, it's the bully who isn't even popular or powerful enough to be a bully. People just ignore him. Like, he would be a bully if anybody paid attention, but instead he's just ignored. And I've been reading more and more about the daddy issues with Trump, and you mentioned this yesterday, Pat.
I did.
Trump had this relationship with his father where his dad was neglectful and Trump constantly wanted to impress his dad. So in comes Putin. Putin's skilled at manipulation in the exact same way that he ends up being a sort of father-type figure to Trump, the better statesman, the smarter guy, the much richer guy, by the way. And if you look at a video of Trump and Putin in Helsinki, that is the relationship that is telegraphed by the dynamic, where Trump doesn't want to upset Putin. He wants to be seen with respect. He wants to please Putin in the way that maybe he was never able to please his dad. And if it weren't for the geopolitical and national damage that it was doing, it would merely be a sad story of a father and son's relationship gone bad. But here, Trump's daddy issues are actually leading to massive, massive repercussions. Let's talk about Stormy Daniels. Stormy Daniels is an adult film actress who had an affair with Donald Trump. She was paid $130,000 in hush money to not talk about it. And the story became the center of a number of controversies related to Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, to possible campaign finance issues. And Stormy Daniels was arrested not long ago. And the second that this arrest took place, it smelled odd to me. It stunk to me. And we know now, thanks to a whistleblower, that the entire thing was planned in advance. Stormy Daniels was arrested in Columbus, Ohio, at a strip club about 2 weeks ago. There were undercover Vice officers there who said, we were there. We saw Stormy Daniels violating an Ohio law because she touched the club goers. And 12 hours after her arrest, the charges were dismissed. But of course, it got a bunch of attention. It helped to further smear and discredit Stormy Daniels, or at least to attempt to do that. But it all seemed really weird from the get-go. Were these officers randomly at that strip club at the exact time that Stormy Daniels was coming through town and performing? It stunk to me like a political smear attempt. And we now have emails from a whistleblower at the city of Columbus which expose that police detectives and Vice officers were emailing back and forth with links to Stormy's upcoming appearance, pictures of Stormy Daniels with Trump, videos of her dancing, and a map of where she'd be performing. And when the arrest happened, police said that Stormy Daniels merely ended up mixed up with a human trafficking and prostitution operation. But of course, if she ended up mixed up in that, why were officers sending each other pictures and videos of Stormy Daniels? Because if Stormy Daniels was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time, you wouldn't have people like Detective Shayna Keckley, who was one of the arresting officers, emailing herself from her personal email to her work email, videos and pictures of Stormy Daniels. And then the bombshell, which is that Officer Shayna Keckley was involved in emailing herself and with other officers. There's an email that has been revealed at this point where she said to another officer, "You're welcome. Thank me in person later. I got the elements. We arrested Stormy this morning." And so now there is every indication that Stormy Daniels didn't accidentally, by chance, get caught up in an operation looking to weed out child trafficking. It was the opposite. It was a pre-planned arrest specifically targeting Stormy Daniels. I'm not surprised. This is what I thought it was from day one, and it turns out that it was.
Yeah, it sounds like a hit job to me too, but I don't think it would be too effective, right? Because the idea is to discredit Stormy Daniels, and then you can say that maybe she didn't have an affair with Trump, or maybe there was no campaign finance violation. But who in the public really cares about this? She was arrested for essentially doing her job.
Well, I am not so sure, because it's all narrative. And even though you and I say, well, hold on a second, the truth of the hush money and the legality of the hush money has no bearing on whether she touched a customer in 2018 in a Columbus, Ohio strip club. We get that. But for the narrative crowd, this actually does discredit Stormy Daniels. And that's why I think it's so dangerous. And Trump is like, let's put aside the Trump thing now. This is evidence that the Columbus police are straight up lying about what happened. And of course, since there is a connection to Trump, there are even more questions that now need to be answered. I initially read that Mayor Ginther, Andrew Ginther, is the mayor of Columbus, Ohio. I read Ginther's furious, and I thought, oh, good, well, he's going to get this taken care of. No, Ginther's furious that people are criticizing the police. This is a corruption scandal. There are political disagreements that we can have, like, what's the optimal tax rate for fairness or for economic growth? This is corruption and cronyism. Whether it links back to Trump or not, it shouldn't be partisan. It shouldn't be political. Whether it's Anthony Weiner or Donald Trump or the Columbus police or whoever, this is corruption plain and simple. And if it is what it appears to be, it should be career ending for the officers that were involved in this fiasco. But because the mayor is angry with the people rather than with the police, as usual, there may be no consequences whatsoever.
Yeah, and the mayor isn't upset with the corruption. He's upset that the cover-up got out, apparently. That's really telling.
No thinking person can doubt that this was politically motivated, as I said, within hours of the arrest. But now we have days of premeditated, proven premeditation, and then back to the original reason for the arrest. Remember, the original arrest happened because Stormy touched customers. We've now learned from Columbus Police Department Chief Kim Jacobs that cops screwed up the arrest because the law prohibits performers from touching patrons only if they are dancers who perform regularly at the club. Stormy Daniels was a guest performer, so she never even should have been arrested in the first place, according to the law. Congratulations to everybody involved. Another complete and total comedy of errors. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum if you're interested. www.davidpakman.com/Reddit, R-E-D-D-I-T.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation with David Faris, who's an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. We've been discussing the book, It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. So, David, we spoke about some of the structural disadvantages that affect Democrats in the United States. We talked about the idea of adding states. Washington, D.C., was mentioned, as well as Puerto Rico, and we talked about some others. What else is on your list of tactics and approaches that Democrats can employ that would be under this general umbrella that you talk about in the book of fighting dirty?
Sure. I think that probably the most important thing that I write about in the book is voting rights. What we've seen over the last 20 years in the Republican Party is a concerted, sort of unified effort to pass laws that are legal, that are constitutional, been upheld by the Supreme Court, but that are explicitly designed to drive down Democratic turnout and to suppress Democratic votes. We're talking about things like these cookie cutter voter ID laws that have been passed in state after state, starting with the Bush administration. We're talking about things like felony disenfranchisement laws, the restrictions that many states have placed on early voting or eliminating days to vote early. All of these are tactics that Republicans are using. They're all legal. Or at least they've been declared legal by the Supreme Court. I disagree. But they're using them because they know that it drives down Democratic turnout. And so in this case, fighting dirty just means sort of restoring the rights of these people who have had their franchise taken away from them. And the way that you can do that, we're fighting this battle on a state-by-state level right now. We're fighting for things like automatic voter registration, or we're challenging voter ID laws, or we're fighting things like the voter purges in Ohio. But what I write about is how all of these problems are amenable to a national piece of legislation passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by a Democratic president. And that piece of legislation, because of the Constitution's elections clause, could eliminate voter ID laws. It could reenfranchise former or even current felons. It could declare a national voting holiday for federal elections. And it could demand that all states have automatic voter registration. And because federal and state elections in most times and places are run at the same time, the states would be forced to comply, probably for all of their elections. Right? The end result of all of this would be adding millions upon millions of Democratic-leaning voters to the voter rolls, be making it easier for them to vote. You would boost voter turnout on election day. And as we've seen again and again, when our people turn out, we win. And when they don't, we lose. And that's why Republicans are fighting so hard to prevent people from voting, because they fear the electorate. They fear the electorate because their policies are radioactive. And the only way that they can stay in power is to artificially drive down turnout. And so, you can call it fighting dirty, you can call it whatever you want, but it's really imperative that Democrats address this crisis in the voting system in this country.
My audience has been increasingly asking me about court packing, packing the court, and looking at an increase to the number of Supreme Court justices. Of course, when the appointed additional justices would be left-leaning rather than right-leaning. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that and how difficult it is to actually implement?
Sure. I think the reason that we're talking about court packing a little bit right now is because of what Republicans did in 2016. Right. Which was that they held a seat open that, President Obama had nominated Merrick Garland to fill that seat, and they just refused to do it. And what they did was they took advantage of another sort of problem with our Constitution, is the Constitution does not always spell out the obligations of the different political actors. So it says advice and consent of the Senate, but it doesn't say whether the Senate has to do it. How do they do it? Are there hearings? None of the ways that we use to confirm nominees to the court are really spelled out in the Constitution at all. So Republicans were right when they said that we don't have to do this, right? And it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of other stuff that's not in the Constitution either. And most important thing that's not in there is the number of justices on the Supreme Court. And so I think probably many of your viewers are familiar with the sort of the failure of FDR's court packing plan in the 30s. So he had a hostile Supreme Court that was striking down important measures of the New Deal. And when he was reelected in 1936 and reinaugurated in 1937, he feared that the Supreme Court was going to strike down the Social Security Act, which is like the signature piece of the New Deal, right? And so he came up with this plan that would have added a justice to the Supreme Court for everyone who was over 70 and wouldn't retire. So it was like age-based. And that plan was defeated not because it was unconstitutional, but because his allies in Congress just wouldn't go along with it. And there's some evidence to suggest he could have gotten something through if he'd just been willing to compromise on adding fewer justices, because that would have added 6. And I think the way that history remembers this incident is that, FDR had this terrible idea. It was defeated. It hurt him. It cost him support over the rest of his second term. But the underlying reality is that, the willingness of both of our parties to abide by these norms about the Supreme Court appointments is dependent on both parties observing them, right, at all times. And so when Republicans broke that bargain in 2016, they opened up a Pandora's box of responses. And so I think the Democrats would be well within their rights to add 2 justices to the Supreme Court the next time they're in power. I do think that they should offer a truce to Republicans in the form of a constitutional amendment. And this is what I actually think they should be talking about right now, is the way that the process is unfair. Some presidents get 0 appointments in 4 years, right? Carter got 0. Now Donald Trump gets 2 in 2 years, it's just preposterous, right? And if we had an amendment that capped tenure on the court at 18 years, gave every president the right to appoint 2 justices for every 4-year term, we could take this ugliness right out of our politics. I think Republicans will say no to that, and I think that Democrats have every right to pack the courts in response.
Let's talk a little bit about the Electoral College. There has been, particularly after Donald Trump lost in the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by almost 3 million votes in 2016, a renewed sort of call for eliminating the Electoral College in favor of a national popular vote. And I'm curious where you kind of come down on it from. Is it actually good strategy for the left? Because on the one hand, it appears as though it has screwed Democrats twice in the last 5 elections. But at the same time, what Trump said is true in the sense that if you know going in that it's a popular vote election and not an Electoral College election, you do campaign differently. And I wonder if it's actually that clear that it would be good for Democrats to get rid of the Electoral College.
Sure. It's a good question. I think one thing to keep in mind is that we almost did have this situation in the opposite direction in 2004. So if John Kerry had won another 100,000 votes in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College, but lost the popular vote.
Right.
So I think the idea that this automatically that the Electoral College is structurally biased against Democrats, I don't think it is in the same way that that the gerrymandered House is or that the U.S. Senate is. I think the problems with the Electoral College are more about democratic legitimacy. So, I think it's just very destructive to the sort of shared sense that power is being exercised over us legitimately for the popular vote loser to take office through this sort of antiquated mechanism of the Electoral College. Unfortunately, I think we're stuck with it because it would require probably a constitutional amendment to get rid of. I know that there's talk of this sort of national popular vote compact, the Interstate Compact, where a bunch of states would get together and say that they would give their electoral votes to the popular vote winner, no matter who won the Electoral College. I don't think anybody knows what the fate of that compact would be in the courts after that election, because it would be contested, obviously, by whoever is losing out.
Do you know? My curiosity about that is, would it have to be contested state by state? In the sense that some of the legal opinions I've read seem pretty adamant that states are not states can decide for themselves, in other words, how they handle the awarding of their state's electoral votes. So do you know more about exactly what the challenge would be?
I mean, I think that the interstate compact people, I think they're on pretty firm constitutional ground, right? I mean, I think that I think that what would happen is that in a handful of states, let's say that this happens, and a Republican wins the Electoral College, who loses the popular vote, if this compact is enforced, and then we have our little constitutional crisis. I think that people, Republicans in a small handful of states would sue. Or they'd sue in the number of states that they need to get back to 270 in the Electoral College, and I think that would be expedited up to the Supreme Court, I'm sure, because of the sort of the timely nature, just the way that Bush v. Gore was, right? And I think that there have been some cases in the past where the Supreme Court has narrowed the right of states to dispense with electoral votes as they see fit, and I think that while a strict reading of the Constitution would suggest that the compact is on firm ground, I think it's less firm in terms of the precedent here, because I think American democracy does have an interest in general. Like, take the Electoral College out of this, but I think that American democracy in general has an interest in not having electors in the Electoral College just do whatever they want, and we've had a few faithless electors here and there in our elections, where in an election where the Electoral College was decided by 30 or 40 or 50, one person is like, I'm not voting for George Bush or whatever. That has happened, and we don't bother with it because it wasn't the deciding vote. But I do wonder what the Supreme Court would do here, because we've seen times in our history where the Supreme Court makes the wrong decision, or invents a precedent, or invents a rationale out of the Constitution to justify making the ruling that it wants to make. And if this were to happen with the current 5-4 Republican majority on the court, my fear is that we'd have the constitutional crisis, we'd have litigation, and ultimately the Supreme Court would say, like, no, the states can't do this. And the reality is, they don't really need to be on firm constitutional footing to do that. They can just do it. So I don't know. I wouldn't hazard a prediction about how this would shake out. And I think it would be productive in the sense that, we could really bring this issue to a boil the next time this happens. And I think it's important to do so. But I'm not super confident that the popular vote folks would win.
In the very limited time we have left, I wanted to get your brief thoughts as to whether any of the changes that you and I have been talking about are Pelosi and Schumer, as the leaders of the Democratic Party, the conduits through which this type of change could be achieved in a realistic sense?
Yeah, I'm skeptical about that.
Yeah.
I don't dislike Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They're very accomplished people. I think they're working very hard. I also think that they're sort of yearning for the return of a norm-based political order it's not coming back from the dead. And sort of they say things all the time that make me think that they still don't quite get the partisan environment that they're operating in. And so I would prefer to see them both replaced by 2021 with sort of younger, more activist-oriented leaders who are willing to sort of make these really difficult decisions, to fight and to fight hard, and if necessary, to fight dirty, as long as it's legal, because the Republican Party is such a threat, I think, to the future of this country right now, that we need political leaders that recognize that. When I see them, they both just look like they're having a little bit too much fun right now. The sense of crisis does not emanate from Chuck Schumer. And I really think we're in a crisis, and I'd like our leadership to reflect that.
The book is called "It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics." We've been speaking with the book's author, David Faris, who's also an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. David, I really appreciate your time today.
It's been great chatting. Thanks for having me on the show, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The BBC is reporting that researchers have found evidence of an existing body of liquid water on the planet Mars. So this is not evidence that there someday, millions of years ago, there was water. This is not evidence of ice, but this is evidence of liquid water on basically what is being described as a lake, although some people are taking issue with its description of being a lake, under Mars's south polar ice cap. And it is about 12 miles across. It's estimated to contain about a meter of water, and it is located 1.5 kilometers below an ice sheet. So imagine you've got 1.5 kilometers of ice, and then below that, a single meter of water. And scientists are being super clear that it really is a body of water. It's not melt water that's stuck between rock and ice. It's a real bona fide body of water. What does this say about the possibility of life on Mars? Absolutely nothing. Scientists continue to explain that the surface of Mars is inhospitable to life as we know it, period. And the search for possible life now has to move beyond the surface and to the subsurface, where you would have presumably protection from radiation. You would have pressure and temperature that would at least make it slightly more likely than life on the surface, which would be extraordinarily unlikely for any of the types of life that we are already familiar with. It's also likely that the lake that was found is very, very salty, because for water to be liquid in such cold weather, as cold as what's on Mars, the water probably needs to have a ton of salt dissolved in it. So in case you were thinking of drinking the water, it would be extraordinarily salty.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Like, how much would you pay for a bottle of Mars water?
Yeah.
And I guess you can't, but maybe if you have a sore throat or something, you could gargle it.
It's not even clear we can get access to this stuff, because we would somehow have to bring or build a means to drill through 1.5 kilometers of ice on Mars. So it's unclear what's next. This is all becoming more and more like Frank Herbert's classic book, Dune. Have you read that one, Pat?
Not that one.
You haven't read that one. That's too bad. Back to reality. This is also interesting because the more planets and moons that we get information about, the more it's becoming clear that surface water is pretty rare. So on Earth, as you might know, we have surface water. Subsurface water we've now found in a few spots. So on 2 of Jupiter's moons, Europa and Ganymede, we've found subsurface water on Enceladus, which is one of Saturn's moons, and now we found it on Mars. So the bigger picture that is kind of being painted for us is that finding life elsewhere might require being able to dig down to where there's water. And this is also important because if we find an exoplanet, meaning a planet outside of our solar system, who knows where, and we identify that there's no surface water, that wouldn't necessarily tell us that there's no life on the planet. We would actually have to look. So very exciting stuff. And meanwhile, on Earth, people still dislike each other because they were born with the wrong skin color, which really kind of puts it in perspective in some way. I love a good trade war hypocrisy story. We've heard the double standards from Donald Trump on trade and on foreign manufacturing for a very, very long time. It even actually predates Trump as president of the United States. This is one of my favorite clips from the David Letterman show. It is of Trump, and I'll play it for you just as a reminder.
As a line of clothing. Now, where were these made?
These were made, I don't know where they were made, but they were made someplace. But they're great. It's ties, shirts, cufflinks, everything sold at Macy's, and they're doing great. #1 selling tie anywhere in the world.
#1 selling tie anywhere in the world. You wouldn't wear that shirt?
We also have them in white and beautiful white.
Where are the shirts made? Bangladesh.
Well, it's good.
Okay.
We employ people in Bangladesh.
Ties? Where are the ties
they
made?
Have to work
These are beautiful ties.
They are great ties.
The ties are made in where? China? China. Ties are made in China.
Well, I'll tell you, and you know what, David, in all fairness, I've been very open about that, and not all of them, by the way, but I've been very open about that. Are you okay? Is the
no,
chair
I'm
was
fine. I know.
Well, I've got another great one for you. The White House recently had an event called the Made in America Product Showcase. The name suggests that it's a showcase of products made in America, made in the United States of America. The White House set up the whole event. They had refreshments, they had drinks, they had snacks and speeches and all sorts of stuff. And the silverware used for the refreshments and snacks was Chinese made. And at least some Republicans and Democrats have been telling the White House, you know, it might be a good idea if the White House had American-made forks and knives, if you want to talk about how it's all about American-made and American manufacturers. And the Sherrill Manufacturing Company has expressed interest in supplying the American-made silverware, but no luck so far. And I get it. Forks and spoons aren't the top priority. I understand that. But if you're all about American-made, and you're holding an event about American-made, and China's being unfair to us, and China's going to stop stealing intellectual property because we're going to get tough on them, why are you using Chinese silverware at an event meant to promote American manufacturers? It's another example of how at every single level, the White House has been a big, deliberate middle finger to the middle class, to anybody who cares about the truth, to anybody who cares about accountability. And meanwhile, reports have started to come in that Trump's running for re-election, officially speaking. He reportedly is already having hats and flags for Trump 2020 manufactured. Not too early, I guess, to start with that. And some of them are made in China. They are being contracted out to Chinese companies. The Chinese companies are claiming that the Trump 2020 flags and hats are being delayed at the American border, possibly because of the trade war that's going on. Now, some of those claims have not been corroborated outside of Chinese media. What is clear is that Donald Trump has a long history of having his stuff made in China and elsewhere. So why would we expect him to stop now? Why would we expect Ivanka Trump to stop having her stuff manufactured in China and Bangladesh and wherever else? And the entire trade thing is just a ruse. That's what everybody has to understand.
Yeah, and the original Make America Great Again hats were sold through a Canadian company, too, at least from the onset. So I guess Trump was contributing to that supposed trade deficit that we have with Canada.
He contributes to every problem he claims to be the solution to. And what you've got to realize is that when the entire trade thing started, Trump was trying things during the early days of his campaign, and even before the campaign when he was sort of feeling it out. One of the things that went well was talking about trade. NAFTA's a disaster. We don't win anymore. I'm going to fix trade. We're going to renegotiate NAFTA. We're going to take China out in some way, and we're going to win again. It's going to be fantastic. He didn't even really know what he was talking about because he doesn't understand trade, but he realized he's getting a pretty good response. He's getting a pretty good response to these offhand comments about NAFTA being bad and China being unfair to us. So he kept going, and the natural conclusion was he woke up one day, he was president, and he said, what the hell? The trade stuff worked well. Let's start a trade war he can't get out of, a trade war he can't win, and more than likely, a trade war that at this point he doesn't even remember how he got into in the first place. I don't think Trump ever realized that once you make these decisions on trade, it's difficult to just undo it because countries retaliate. And now to go back to where we were, you need high-level meetings, you need negotiations. He's kind of stuck with this situation, and it was a ruse from the beginning. We've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day. Many of you do call very, very late at night, early in the morning. Here's a caller commenting on those USA chants that have become very common at Trump presidential campaign style rally.
Hey, David, I just wanted to say I hate the USA chant more than any chant. Maybe like, Jews will not replace us is worse, but the USA chant is pretty bad. And,
okay, I guess that's it. They didn't have anything else to say. Listen, I don't have a problem with people chanting things at rallies. I think that there are many worse chants than USA, USA. Like, for example, kill the Jew would be like a worse chant, I think, than USA. But I understand what the caller is saying, which is that in the context of these Trump rallies, in the context of those rallies that contain endless lies and distortions and all sort of nonsense, I understand why the entire concept of just USA, 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 the meaning it takes on is sort of a wild, angry crowd cheering for things that they don't even really fully understand, but that it includes stuff that's really bad for a lot of the people that are in our country. And it's sort of an exclusionary chant in a lot of ways.
Well, it doesn't bother me because it can be perceived as nationalistic so much. It just bothers me because I find it obnoxious.
It's obnoxious, and also a lot of the stuff Trump is talking about at the rallies isn't good for USA. It might be good for the very rich. It might be good for in some cases, banks or whoever's regulations are being reduced, but it's not actually good for the USA. And the people there aren't even informed enough to realize that.
Did you hear the pro-England chants at the World Cup? Those were obnoxious.
What were those?
They were singing songs, the national anthem. They had like a little horn they were playing.
Yep.
Wouldn't recommend it.
You didn't like that?
Did not like that.
Okay. Pat doesn't really know about soccer culture, though. You admit that.
Yeah. I mean, I pretend to every 4 years when the World Cup comes around, but aside from that, no.
All right. Well, maybe the U.S. will make it next time around, and people here will have something to cheer for other than you. They'll have an opportunity to say USA, USA in a way that's not implicitly supporting the harebrained and ridiculous policies of President Donald Trump. We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. The bonus show is world famous. It's accessible to members and patrons. Number one, on the bonus show, we will talk about how a vandal demolished Donald Trump's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, called cops to say see you soon, and was ultimately bailed out by the last person to damage Donald Trump's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Very unusual story. The attorney for Brock Turner argues that Turner's sexual assault conviction should be overturned. And we will also talk about Betsy DeVos proposing rules that would cut student loan relief by an estimated $13 billion, because these kids don't need to have help with their student loans. Forget about the fact that wages are stagnant for 40 years and that college costs continue to go up. They need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps from the boots they can't even afford and just right themselves economically. That and more on today's bonus show. Get access 2 ways. Become a member at www.joinpakman.com. If you want to save 40%, you can do it with the coupon code VOTESOON18. Second way to get access to the world famous bonus show is to become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show for at least $5 a month. $5, $5.01, $500, as long as it's at least $5, you will get instant access to the bonus show. We will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.